Sport Business Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry. I'm Catherine Davies, America's Bureau Chief of Sport Business, and I'm the host of this weekly podcast. This week, we're leading off with a very deep dive into the English Premier League's team sponsorship market this season, on the back of a two-part extended snapshot published by our in-house sponsorship experts. I'll have Ben Cronin and Fayez Samadi alongside me to bring you the highlights and some of the key deals from over 150 new and renewed sponsorship agreements across all 20 Premier League clubs. We then move on to a brief overview of our annual Global Media Report, a not-to-be-missed analysis of the global media rights industry, with Executive Editor Imran Yusuf providing some key information. And we'll finish up with Martin Ross and Jonathan Rest providing their views and insights into the Commonwealth Games decision to recommend the Indian city of Ahmedabad as the host of the 2030 Commonwealth Games, and what they think the future holds for the so-called friendly games. All this is coming your way in just a few seconds. But before we start, we'd like to remind you, our listeners, to please leave us your feedback on today's podcast in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms. Let us know if you like what you're hearing and what you'd like to know more about. Now, let's move straight on to our first topic for the day. I'm joined now by Ben Cronin, our Global Sponsorship Editor, and Fayez Samadi, Deputy Editor of Sponsorship. Welcome back to the podcast, gentlemen.
Hello, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Now, neither of you has been on the podcast for some weeks. I'm guessing you've been very busy with this Premier League sponsorship snapshot, which is, I might mention, hardly a snapshot, given the impressive breadth and detail contained within. We'll be dissecting that in depth in a minute, but tell me, what else has been on your radar in the past few weeks?
I mean, my time is taken up as a Watford fan, feeling mostly sad about football and, being part of the never-ending merry-go-round of us sacking our managers, which we just did before the international break. We've also gone for the old chestnut of rehiring an old manager in Javi Gracia. He was liked very much at the club in his first term, but we'll see how his second act goes. But yeah, hoping for some hope, really.
It's tough work being a Watford fan. I know I'm a Spurs fan, so I know how you feel. Ben, where have you been?
Where have I been? I've been writing this Premier League snapshot. I've only published it about 20 minutes ago, so I've been head down in that. Like Faiz, I'm also looking forward to the resumption of the Premier League season. I always give a big yawn when the international break comes on, so I'm looking forward to that. I was going to ask you who your Premier League team is. I didn't realise you were a Spurs fan.
That's it. Guilty as charged. As we've previously discussed, this is a period of transition for the Premier League. And as you allude to in the snapshot, many clubs are going to have to be ready to make up a shortfall in sponsorship income when the self-imposed ban on main shirt betting sponsorship comes into force. Now, tell me, which of the clubs are best insulated from the ban, would you say?
So looking at the ones we've covered, Brighton is actually strangely insulated from the betting ban. They do have a deal with Betway, but it's not a major deal and it doesn't confer any of their shirt assets. They haven't done any deals with any of the so-called white label betting brands either, which are often criticised when they're done by other clubs. It's slightly ironic in the case of Brighton as well, because when you look at their owner, Tony Bloom, he made most of his fortune in the betting industry, but they've got the good fortune to actually be based in the same city as American Express, which explains why they've also got a front of shirt sponsorship deal with them. Stadium naming deal. There's quite a few assets tied up in it, training ground and training kit as well. So that's insulated them from the betting ban to a certain extent. And then you look at their sleeve sponsorship deal. They've got a deal with Experience Kissimmee as well, which is a US tourism body. So they haven't gone down the route of having a load of betting sponsors, and certainly not white labels to other clubs. Outside of Brighton, Big Six are naturally insulated from the ban as well, mainly because of their global fan bases. When they do betting deals, they can attract more reputable betting brands, UK-based brands with UK licenses, and they can often do lower tier deals with those brands, which confer LED, but don't attract any of the criticisms that you might get if you put a betting sponsor on the front of the shirt.
Well, those are the clubs that are possibly best insulated. Which clubs would you say are the most exposed?
It's an interesting question because, I think to say as a top line thing, I know we've covered it a lot in previous podcasts, but all of them are quite exposed. Certainly outside the top six, many clubs, I think it's 11, have a front of shirt sponsorship with a betting brand. So I'm sure this has been trailed for long enough. They'll have plans. But just going through the research for the report that we all did, which, as Ben said, we were pretty meticulous going through each of these clubs' portfolios. And on the face of it, someone like Crystal Palace would seem quite exposed because they have their three main assets tied up with betting brands. So Net88 are the front of shirt sponsor, who are obviously an Asian betting brand, but they also have the training kit asset. And then they also have Cayenne, another Asian betting brand, as their sleeve sponsor. Cayenne were previously Nottingham Forest front of shirt sponsor, now on the Palace sleeves. That's three of their biggest assets tied up in betting. They also have two further lower tier betting deals with Betway and XBet. Those, as Ben was alluding to, was one of those lower tier deals that's pretty much LED only. They don't confer any branding on the club website or sort of signage assets, but they get lots of exposure on the LED minutes. And these things are quite lucrative deals for these betting brands and for the clubs. So in one way, you'd say Crystal Palace, 4 betting brands quite exposed, 3 of their biggest assets also exposed. But if you could turn that on its head, speaking to people in the industry, it could actually work in their favour to some degree, because they have good relationships, obviously, with 4 different betting brands. And now it's only the main shirt asset is the one that they'll be banned from going on, but they're still a sleeve, they're still a training kit sponsor. And, there could be some sort of internal competition almost driven between these brands, who will all be seeking good exposure still, regardless of the betting ban. They have an existing relationship with Palace. Palace are on a real high. They won the FA Cup for the first time in their history. They're in the Europa Conference League. These are all good upsides for exposure, which is the main thing these betting brands are chasing. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that goes, because it could be that, as I say, on the surface, they look quite exposed, but they could actually come out of it quite well. Another team who I'd say are less exposed, but also have quite a lot of betting brands, are Newcastle. Again, not any of their top tier assets, but they have a deal with BetMGM as their official betting partner. In the highest tier, they've got fairly prominent signage, hospitality, player content creation. Then they've got Fun88, who were previously the club's front of shirt sponsor. They have now moved to being the club's official Asian betting partner. And they also have a sort of LED-based lower tier sponsorship with sportsbet.io. I should say that Fun88 is also heavily driven by LED advertising. But again, that's 3 brands. That's just Newcastle diversifying and splitting up their betting rights. But given that none of them are on those prominent assets, and certainly not a front of shirt, they'll probably feel like they can either keep those deals going and because, as I say, the main thing these brands want are exposure, or being Newcastle, being a big club, they probably wouldn't have any trouble replacing them with sponsors from another category.
Have any of them made plans for next season yet, or is that something we'll expect to see later on in the season?
So as far as from speaking to sources, Everton have made plans for their front of shirt sponsor to move to their sleeve next season. And that's quite an interesting story, because I think they they tried to get out in front of the betting ban as much as possible. And they had been looking actually for a brand to swap with Stake this season, but they weren't able to identify a front of shirt sponsor in time. So as it stands, Stake is going to move across next season. The reason they were trying to get out in front of it was because they anticipated that there's going to be 11 other clubs, 12 if you count Chelsea, which doesn't have a front of shirt sponsor. There were going to be a lot of clubs that were looking to find a front of shirt sponsor at the same time, so it would create a buyer's market. And the reason Stake were prepared to be so flexible and either move aside this season or next season is because wanted to get that sleeve asset on more favourable terms. So yeah, they were prepared to step aside this season.
Another club that's done pretty well in terms of planning for next year is West Ham. Our colleague Matthew Glendinning did an interview with the Chief Commercial Officer of Boyle Sports, Troy Cox, who said that, following this season where they stop being front of shirt partner, they're going to take on the training kit rights and then maybe look to augment those with other assets because they want to stick with West Ham. So, that's someone else who's got something in the bag. I would just add that myself, Ben, my colleagues, Matthew Williams, Matthew Glendinning, we talked to a lot of people. We've been doing a lot of research for this, and there are quite a few more clubs who have more of a plan than perhaps is being presented. It's all very much, in the background at the minute because things haven't been completely signed off. But, for myself, I know of at least one club in the Premier League who have got a pretty solid plan for post-betting front of shirt ban, and that's in place. So, yeah, a lot of these things we can't talk about just yet, but hopefully it will be in the not too distant future. But I think they're getting their ducks in a row.
So they're obviously in the planning for next year's ban, but it's in terms of this season, can you tell me which of the clubs had a particularly good summer from a commercial perspective?
Funnily enough, it's tied to the clubs that are also the most successful on the pitch at the moment. Liverpool and Arsenal are doing very well. Arsenal is trying to grow its secondary sponsorship tier at the moment. I think they've got a plan to double secondary sponsorship income in the 3-year period. I think that started in 2023. They've got some good brands as well, and they've done some award-winning campaigns with them. If you think about their Dirt is Good campaign with the Persil affiliated brand Dirt is Good. Liverpool are obviously doing well on the pitch, and also most of their major assets are tied down, but they're also getting good numbers. They've established a very decent floor price for their secondary sponsorship tier, and they agreed some good renewals with some blue chip brands this summer. Hire is a sponsor which only associates itself with top properties, so they also did a deal with Paris Saint-Germain. So Liverpool keeping good company there, Champions League winners last season. So those two are both doing pretty well, and that's recognised by the agencies that we've been speaking to as well. Man United, not so good. They've lost a few brands. We reported that the deal with Marriott, the hotel chain, had come to an end. They decided not to renew. There were mitigated circumstances for that. Marriott was actually undergoing a cost restructuring effort at the time, and they just had the misfortune to be coming out of that deal. I think the timing was against them. They've also lost a few other brands like Therabody, although again, Therabody have been dropping a few sponsorship deals. They had at one stage they were very acquisitive and partnering with a lot of clubs, but they've kind of dialed back their activities. And they've also lost a sponsor called Melita, which I think is a coffee brand, and Wow Hydrate. And they've offset them to a certain extent. They've done some new deals with Coke. They've done a renewal with Apollo Tyres. But yeah, it doesn't, I mean, from the outside looking in, it looks like it's been a bit of a sort of tough summer. And they're also, of course, looking for a training kit sponsor. At the moment, they had a deal with Tezos, and when the new training kit was launched for this season, it was actually launched with a blank space where the sponsor should be, which is never a good look. And our understanding is also their sleeve sponsorship deal with DXC Technologies is coming to an end at the close of this season. So remains to be seen if that one's going to be renewed. And it's probably not the best time to be taking those rights to market, given the struggles they're having on the pitch and the fact that they haven't won 2 games consecutively under Ruben Amorim. That could all change against Liverpool this weekend, but we'll see.
Well, Fayez, you mentioned the fact that Chelsea doesn't have a front of shirt sponsorship deal at all. And we mentioned that in a previous podcast. Let's look at the flip side of what you've just told us. Which clubs have fared worse over the summer?
Dear, this is the hospital pass question, Catherine. Just before I say anything, don't go in my DMs, anybody. This is based on decent research. Without wanting to be too harsh or anything, I think it's a fair thing to say that if you've gone into the start of a Premier League season as a Premier League club without a sponsor for one of your main assets, that can be chalked up as a miss, a bit of a failure, because the exposure to Premier League probably only gets greater every year. Even if you're signing short-term deals, they're going to be worth a good chunk of money to your club, even if it's only for 1 year. And the received wisdom is you have people queuing up for those assets because it's such a popular global league. So if you haven't got one, that's probably a bit of a red flag. So with that in mind, I think you have to look at someone like Chelsea. Even though they are a big six club, they still don't have, as we've said, a front of shirt sponsor. I think there was some thinking that perhaps after being declared, world champions of this first new format of the Club World Cup, which is a pretty big achievement, that would only sort of heighten their prospects of finally securing a permanent front of shirt sponsor ahead of the start of the season. That clearly hasn't happened. We understand that that's sort of in part tied to the club's inconsistency on the pitch, and from sources we've spoken to, the sort of team owners don't want to commit to a multi-year deal at a lower price when their ambition is to be higher up the league and playing consistently at the highest level in the Champions League and what have you. That said, though, they've now missed out on a lot of revenue, even if it would have been a lower number for a number of years. And allied to that is the fact they don't have a sleeve sponsor either, and that one's in particular interesting because they've had 4 different sleeve sponsors in the past 3 seasons. They had crypto firm Whalefin, then they had BingX, they had a brand called Fever, then they've had the ticketing brand Live Nation. They've all appeared in the position over the past 3 seasons. That's 4 brands. BingX switched from the sort of sleeve sponsor to being the training kit sponsor. And these are just 2 really key assets. It doesn't matter how big you are, you should be finding sponsors for them, particularly if you're as big a club as Chelsea. Alongside that, I would say someone like Fulham and Chelsea are the only 2 clubs who came into the 25-26 Premier League season without a sleeve sponsor. We've just covered Chelsea. Fulham had Hotel Marketplace Webbeds as sleeve sponsor last season, but that deal doesn't appear to have continued beyond the end of last year. Again, that's a really major asset. And we've talked a bit about Fulham having other priorities perhaps at the moment in terms of building out their new Fulham Pier with their redeveloped stand, and I think that's been tied into a lot of what they're hoping will be sunnier times in sponsorship because a lot of brands and sponsors are coming in with deals tied to the pier. But still, your sleeve asset is one of your biggest assets, and going unsold is surprising. So they are the two clubs I would point out.
Well, we talked in a previous podcast as well about certain trends like Guinness sponsoring several clubs. We mentioned splitting the G's, which I think was very, very timely of us. So let's take a look at trends. And what do you two think are the most interesting new sponsorship trends that have emerged this season?
So just in the course of my research, I think one sector that's been particularly interesting, and it's quite specific, it's the sort of Dubai real estate market, specifically Dubai. And sort of one of the biggest deals going in this area is Arsenal's with Sober Realty, which I think the first deal was agreed in September 2023. They're a Dubai-based real estate firm. And when that deal was announced, I think it sort of raised a few eyebrows because they were the first to bring in that category, and I think from that market in particular. And in September 23, signed the first deal. And then about 6-7 months later, in February of the next year, they already decided to upgrade that deal with a significantly higher financial commitment because they took on naming rights of the club's training ground, which is a big asset to take on when you've just been in the market 7 months as a new sponsor to the Premier League. And then following that, so we just talked about Chelsea's Travaise trying to get a front of shirt sponsor. They did a very Chelsea thing and signed a very short-term deal in April of this year with another Dubai-based real estate firm, Damac Properties, who signed a deal to become Chelsea's front of shirt sponsor for the final, I think, 8 weeks of the 2024-2025 season. That deal is also tied in with licensing and IP rights that Damac Properties, I believe, are building sort of Chelsea residences in Dubai that will be, I think, Chelsea branded and have club IP like the logo and the badge, and perhaps even within the apartment block. So that's quite an interesting novel space that goes beyond just your kind of sponsorship exposure and has moved into a much wider deal. So there were those two. And then most recently, just before the start of the season, was Nottingham Forest. They signed a new sponsorship with a company called Object One, who, yet again, are a Dubai-based real estate firm. And they've come in and sponsored a Premier League club. They are featuring on the shirt of the club's academy teams, have a perimeter LED signage at the City Ground and at the academy. And so they're another one that's come in. And it feels like this category, just sort of thinking about it more widely, analytically, I suppose, could do quite a lot for teams in terms of replacing some of that betting money. Because if you think that Sober Realty are now training ground naming rights sponsor, Damac came in, albeit as a short period, as a front of shirt sponsor. Those are like hefty assets with decent price tags. Object One currently on the club's academy team front of shirt. So it feels like maybe some clubs will start looking that way and thinking, well, if that's a new area for us to open up into, got the top of the tier, they've got a mid-tier team in Forest, there might be more opportunities for more clubs.
Ben, what trends have you seen emerging from this year's sponsorship deals?
I thought virtual private networks is an interesting category. If you think about what people use virtual private networks for, in some cases, people use them for pirating content. And I've heard a few people in agencies describing this as biting the hand that feeds, because at the same time, these clubs are making or sharing massive TV revenues from the sale of the Premier League's commercial rights. They're also promoting these VPN services. From speaking to some people about that, has irked the Premier League. I've heard that some clubs have been criticised for taking these deals. So that's a trend to watch. I don't think they're necessarily massively valuable deals either. It's an interesting trend, not necessarily one that's going to continue, I'd guess.
Yeah, that is interesting in that the Premier League works in partnership with La Liga on combating piracy and tackling VPNs. And I did hear that the La Liga loses between 600 and 700 million euros a year from piracy, which is the equivalent of the summer transfer windows. So you'd think that they would come down harder on sponsorships from companies like VPNs, given that's what they're known for, isn't it? The piracy in football and live sport.
Yeah, we should say that, it's not always the case. People can use VPNs for other things as well. But yeah, there is an interesting sort of connection there between the two things.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other trends that we should take note of?
It's perhaps not a trend as such. The airline category is by no means new. I found one particular deal quite interesting, which was Crystal Palace again. They signed a new sponsorship with Sun Express, a new joint venture airline between Lufthansa and Turkish Airlines that specialises in flights to European tourist destinations. It's quite interesting that, I guess, mid-tier club, upper mid maybe now, has signed an airline deal. Most of those deals tend to go to the biggest clubs. You think of your Emirates and your Etihads, and then, with Man City and Arsenal and the like. Crystal Palace us are now playing in that space. And what I thought was particularly interesting, we learned from sources that Sun Express held a sort of tender process with football clubs across Europe, and there were more than 30 clubs that were interested in and responded to this tender. Our understanding is they were primarily from the Premier League and the Bundesliga, and they were all vying for this contract with Sun Express, and Crystal Palace came out on top. Our understanding is the brand had a series of requests of these clubs to explain how they would target, I think it was 4 different types of consumers that they want to get closer to, and the clubs came and did their thing, all 30 plus of them. Palace had the strongest proposal. I think it also helped that Crystal Palace in South London is pretty close to 2 of the UK's biggest airports in London Heathrow and London Gatwick. But it's a pretty sizable deal for them, I think, outside of their top tier asset. It's quite, I imagine, a shot in the arm for the clubs outside the top 6, that if you've got a good proposal and you go to market with it, you can compete with 30 other clubs in Europe and come out on top. So I thought that was worth mentioning.
Right. Thank you very much, you two. That was a very detailed and informative expose of the sponsorship 2-part section that you did. The first part, I would certainly direct our readers to the 2-part snapshot. The first one is from Arsenal to Fulham. The second one from Leeds to Wolves. It's a superb piece of work, and it's the kind of meticulous, in-depth research that Sport Business is known for. So congratulations to all of your team for doing a wonderful piece of work, and we will speak to you again very soon.
Stay ahead in the business of sport with Sport Business newsletters, covering the biggest stories driving the industry, delivered straight to your inbox at no cost. Sign up today at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, bringing you the latest sport business industry news. I'm here with Imran Yusuf, Sport Business Executive Editor. Imran, this is your debut podcast as Executive Editor. Congratulations on the new position and welcome back to the airwaves.
Thanks, Catherine. Great to be here.
Now, I've brought you on because our media team, not to be outdone by our sponsorship team, has also released a brand new report, the 2025 edition of our Global Media Report, which, as the email that many of our listeners will have received this morning, provides exclusive media data with sharp editorial analysis. Imran, this report is a mainstay in the Sport Business stable now. It's a beautiful volume with incisive analysis, key data, and beautiful charts and tables, among much else. Can you tell us more about what the Global Media Report is for those who might not be in the know?
Yeah, for those poor souls who aren't in the know, our Global Media Report, GMR as we call it, we do this every year. We've been doing this for over a decade, and it's essentially our annual breakdown of the sports industry's biggest revenue stream, which remains media rights. We really use our rights tracker database as the foundation for this report. It is the most comprehensive database of sports broadcasting data in the world. And what does the report have in it? Well, as in previous editions, it basically breaks down the global market by sport, by property, and by territory, by market. So we cover the top 10 sports, top 10 properties, top 10 markets. And we go deep. We provide total values for those. We look at the big deals, but we also contextualize those numbers. What do they mean? What's the direction of travel? Where things are going? And that intelligence comes out of our team's daily contact with the markets, careful research, decades experience covering the business. And because of that, we're confident that this report has the most accurate set of global media rights values there is out there.
Look at some of the nitty-gritty in the report. What are the big numbers that jump out this year? And do they actually tell a story about the industry?
Yeah, so the headline value is just under $58 billion in 2025. That's the global value of sports media rights, we think. That's actually below last year's value. That's because last year included the Olympic Games, of course, and the UEFA European Championships, 2 marquee events that pushed up the value. So because of that, maybe the best comparison is with 2023, when the total value came in at slightly under $56 billion. So there's been a growth of about 3.3% in 2025 compared to then. So that's a stable, if unspectacular, growth. However, the projection for 2026, which of course has a FIFA World Cup in it, is $66.42 billion. Because the report looks at the past few years, it also looks at projections for the next couple. So compared to 2024, that would be an increase of 6.2%. It's an increase. And does that mean the direction of travel for global sports media rights is still broadly up and to the right? There's been a lot of pronouncements, some on this podcast, some elsewhere in recent months, years, about the decreasing value of sports media rights generally, obviously driven by, changes in consumer behavior, global media consumption, etc. I think the answer is yes and no. Top tier properties are likely to see no real drop off. Obviously, there's the number one, the NFL. The NFL always wins, as we say in the report. But also the likes of the Indian Premier League, I think, will see growth for many years, cycles to come. Obviously, this year, over the last year, certainly, the NBA's new deals being signed, they're reflected in the report from next year. That will actually push the Premier League into third place. So the NBA leapfrogs it into second place next year. I mean, certainly that's the case because we have everything sort of lined up. And the Premier League itself is an intriguing case. I think internationally it's boom time. Domestically, it could be a challenge from sort of the end of the decade onwards. 29-30 is when the next domestic deals come up. You've discussed that previously with Frank Dunn. But I think, look, broadly, there is a pattern. The top guys are generally okay. It's the middle and lower tier properties are finding this landscape more challenging. And interestingly, that also applies to territories. And those with stronger media ecosystems are taking a greater share of the overall pie. So the top 10 markets we have making up 83.7% of the total value of global sports media rights. That's up from last year's 80. And the US keeps growing. It's grown its dominance. This year it holds over half the value, 50.1%. And, perhaps this reflects broader macroeconomic trends, but the US is widening its gap with Europe. You see the UK, still number 2 in the world, but the growth is pretty mediocre. The projected compound annual growth rate from 21 to 28 is about 2.5%. Not terrible, not great. And we're seeing that reflected. Spain, Germany, Italy, France, they all each hold between sort of 3 and 4% each of the global total. It's growth where we're not seeing a lot in these markets. France in particular, struggling. It's still in the top 10 for now, but kind of hanging on. The direction of travel is not encouraging. Again, the compound annual growth rate is actually minus 1.2% in those 2021 to 28 7 years. The report looks at all of this. It looks at, for example, the last year had the Club World Cup that very much sort of took center stage. You've discussed this as well, Catherine. It's dominated the football conversation, has it? Not just the commercial, but also the sort of political. And next year, FIFA will be obviously very much to the fore. They'll be the stars of next year's reports. If you like, the World Cup will actually sort of help propel football to revenues of over 24 billion in its media rights in 2026.
So lots of talk about the future, Imran. And in these times of flux in the sports media world, are there forecasts in the Global Media Report to help our listeners navigate the years to come?
Yes, exactly, Catherine. I mean, we look at the current deals, but we also look at future deals to come, which may not have kicked in yet. And then we also model using, again, the intelligence I talked about earlier, to get an accurate reflection of the direction of travel for the properties, for the sports, for the markets. As well as that, we have a section that sort of looks ahead at some of the biggest sort of sports media news stories or events or happenings in 2026. I think over the next year, the sale of UEFA club competitions will be one of the biggest, if not the biggest stories we've seen just this week. Relevant tender being released in those top 5 European markets, as well as a global package. Liga will be very interesting. We've sort of previewed how that might and how the conversation might be a year from now. Obviously, we've looked at their subscribers for their new D2C channel, but where might we be in a year's time? And again, I think the FIFA World Cup, I think you wrote that entry actually, Catherine. Will that boost media rights sales for international properties which come in, want to sell football? What impact will that have on the wider market? We're sort of previewing that in the report as well.
Well, I think the GMR is essential reading for people in the business, isn't it, Imran? And we're all going to be down in Monaco next week for SportTel, and you can speak to us about how you can get a copy of the GMR for yourselves. Thank you very much, Imran, for that snapshot on what the GMR is about. And we'll all be in place in Monaco next week. Imran and I will be there with the rest of our team, and we will be able to provide more information about it there.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Imran. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back for the final section of the podcast.
Stay ahead in the business of sport with trusted news, data, and analysis across media rights, sponsorship, and more. Explore our subscription options at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, bringing you the latest sport business industry news and insight. I'm delighted to note that I've got the dream team of Martin Ross, Global News Editor, and Jonathan Rest, Global News Reporter, back on the line. Good to have you two back with me. I have missed your usual banter and interactions.
Hello, Catherine. Nice to be here. Nice to see you, Catherine. I've survived Scotland beating Belarus. Belarus had 22 shots against Scotland on Sunday at Hampden. So there we go. But Scotland still won. And also managed to squeeze out a win against Greece somehow. So we are the jammiest nation in the world right now, but we're loving it.
Well, Canada held Colombia to a 0-0 draw, which we're very pleased about because, Colombia's up there.
That's
so
far
that
more
shows
respectable, yeah.
I would think so, yes. So to the topic at hand, you've both come on to talk about a major new event update. the story that you wrote this week, Martin, about India being likely to pip Nigeria to the post as host of the 2030 Commonwealth Games, with the city of Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat recommended by the Games Executive Board as the proposed host. Now, Martin, this is a huge opportunity for India to establish a reputation for hosting major multi-sports events 20 years on from the controversies that surrounded the Delhi 2010 Commonwealth Games. Why did those games go so badly wrong?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I mean, you say set to pip. I mean, this is usually a fait accompli. It needs to be approved at the General Assembly here in Glasgow on November 26th, but see no reason why it won't be. So the Games will be going to Ahmedabad in 2030, which is, a really exciting moment for India as it looks to a potential Olympic hosting in 2036, which we'll talk about. And it's a huge moment. I mean, we're going to dwell on a negative, first of all, because we have to, and we have to look back. For anybody listening, we are going to also talk about the positives of this for India. I mean, 2010 was such a pivot, for all the wrong reasons, such a pivotal moment for India sort of hosting of major sports events. Delhi was an unmitigated disaster. It has, really hosted no major multi-sports international games since. I was having a look. It's hosted the South Asian Games. It will host the World Badminton next year. It's hosted Thomas and Uber Cup, also in badminton, some World Junior Squash. And of course, it's successfully hosted EPL. But it, as a hosting location, it was toxic for so long, the back of Delhi, and it created this kind of tainted legacy. The budget ballooned massively from it. The original budget was $270 million US, ended up being $4.1 billion. There was corruption allegations, there was poor ticket sales. I think, remember, the swimming pool was an issue around the water quality, construction delays, payment claims outstanding. People who were working in the industry at the time and sports fans will remember the images of the athletes' village, the leaking roofs, the rooms which are flooded, I think, with monsoon water. I think there was a report, I think it was The Guardian at the time, said that 18 of the 34 blocks in the village were ready at the time, just before it was about to open. So, it was a huge disaster.
So, Martin, from what you're saying, it sounds like a real litany of disasters in the 2010 Games. How did that look in the post-mortem after the Games finished?
Yeah, there was a report from the Indian State Auditor in 2011, a very damning report looking into the kind of federal, local government failures to examine the organising committee's proposals, the budget, the actions. And one of the lines from the report said that appropriate due diligence was conspicuously absent at all levels. And there's various question marks at the time over contract awards, tendering processes, sort of that procurement process you have to go through with the Games. I think that they were often, according to the report, awarded after just a single bid or on a nomination basis. All of this left exorbitant rates charged by, the delays, left exorbitant rates charged by contractors to try and counter these delays in the lead up to the Games. The Games were very nearly cancelled in that the delegations from certain countries were, weighing up whether to pull out or not. They went ahead, but the images beamed around the world were hugely damaging. As a hosting location, it was meant to shine a light, as you can imagine, on it, and had the complete opposite effect. There were some positives, I suppose. The Delhi Metro was expanded. There was public spaces were upgraded. But it will be 20 years, of course, since. And now what an opportunity, what a golden opportunity India has now to show itself as a vibrant, young, new, digital savvy nation, but also crucially a hosting location for major sports events with an eye on the Olympics.
Well, it's certainly true that there's not that many contenders these days, are there, for these mega events due to the excessive costs of hosting these games and building the facilities. But in India's case, this is bigger than just the 2030 Commonwealth Games, isn't it? It's a precursor, as we mentioned, to India hosting the Olympic Games in 2036. So how close is that to happening? John, you've got a bit to say about this, don't you?
Yeah, I don't know how close it is to happening, but no one really knows under the new IOC presidency what route they're going to go down, whether we're going to have these discussions as it was that Thomas Barker had, or whether they're going to go to an official bidding and system that we had decades ago. But certainly the Indian Olympic Association want to host these games in 2036, as does Qatar. They have come out quite vocally. There's been talk just this week of sponsors in Germany backing a potential German, multi-city German bid. So it's going to be quite a competitive landscape for 2036, but certainly India has been set in the stone for this for a good couple of years now. They've already hired Populous to kind of work on a master plan for the games. They are really using, I guess, their IOC membership to kind of lobby, if you like, in the corridors of Lausanne and wider IOC events, the strength of the India bid. Now, Nita Ambani is an IOC member from India. She is the wife of Reliance chairman Mukesh Ambani, who I think is still the richest man in Asia, I believe, certainly India. And they are really bankrolling this. There's been a lot of talk over the last year, really since Paris, I think, wasn't it, Martin? There was a press conference that the IOC did in Paris, and Sophie Verma, who's the MD of television and marketing, and she was talking about the next kind of generation of commercial activity for the IOC, and she was asked specifically about the Indian market, Indian brands coming in. People have talked for some time about Reliance coming in as an IOC top sponsor, and, you know, kind of that all being linked into some kind of Olympic bid. And she went on the record saying India is one of the largest economies, GDP is increasing. We would love to welcome a first new top sponsor from India. I'm sure this will happen soon. So is that linked into a games bid? Quite possibly, but certainly Nita Ambani on the inside of the IOC, her husband as chairman of Reliance, is a pretty powerful combination with Modi at the head of India wanting major sports events in the country. I think it's a hell of a compelling bid that they've got. And obviously the Commonwealth Games serves as a nice little kind of warm-up for that.
Yeah, it does. The timing's interesting, though. I mean, it can't be a full kind of dress rehearsal for an Olympic Games. Not that Commonwealth Games would be like to be described that way, but in the sense that the IOC will clearly want to award the hosting far more than 6 years out from Games. I mean, Brisbane was awarded 11 years in advance. LA was 11 years in advance. Paris, obviously 7, because those two cities were jointly awarded. But they will be keeping a more than keen eye on this process, the timelines, the sort of that. I mean, government has changed since Delhi, clearly, but there's a local and national government involvement, looking for any red flags. There was a visit from the Indian Olympic Association to the IOC most recently, I think in July, at which they laid out a vision for Ahmedabad to be the Olympic host. So I think at that meeting there were he gave them the talk through the requirements and evaluation criteria necessary for a successful bid. So we don't quite know how close we are, but certainly in the past 2 or 3 years, when you talk to people around that hosting and strategy movement, there is a strong feeling that India will for sure be hosting the Olympics very soon, unless there's any reason not to, as we discussed.
Well, you can certainly see the commercial impact that the Olympics, or to a lesser extent the Commonwealth Games, could have in India, and hosting these games in such a huge digital-first economy. And just, with allusion to that, India has a very young population. Pretty much everybody is connected. They have cheap data there. It's among the cheapest data rates in the world. Everybody watches cricket on their phones. But in India, when an Indian sportsman or woman is doing well, the country goes crazy. And I'm thinking of the javelin thrower Neeraj Chopra, who's won gold medals in the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games, and he's a superstar. And India doesn't often win Olympic gold medals. They've won some in hockey, but in other sports. And so I think depending on which sports are in the Commonwealth Games and how big it would actually be, could have a very big commercial impact in India. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know how big it's going to be. I asked Katie Sadler, who's the CEO of Commonwealth Sport, sort of rebranded Commonwealth Games Federation, if you like. I asked her a year ago, and she, at that point, was estimating around 15 sports in 2030. That wasn't a India-specific comment, but obviously there's going to be only 10 in Glasgow next summer. Clearly, it's going to be bigger. It's whatever a host can accommodate, really, but it will be bigger for sure. And yeah, I mean, there's sports like, obviously, T20 cricket, shooting, field hockey, and wrestling. 4 of those, cricket particularly, but the 4 of those hugely popular in India because they have cricket. No explanation needed, but the others do very, very well. So you could see those coming back onto the program, which would really help to boost the program, which a drop in the ocean compared to maybe what there's a process going on right now for the Olympic media rights in India, which will involve cricket in 2028. But nonetheless, yeah, there's some real sort of commercial spurs, if you like, for a Commonwealth Games in India.
India is probably quite well positioned to host the Games, given the size of the country and the economy. But when you look at the Commonwealth Games in the past and bidders who were interested and then pulled out, I'm thinking of a couple of cities in Canada that were interested but withdrew because of the cost. And then, of course, the games that were awarded to Victoria, the state of Victoria in Australia, and they withdrew in 2023. And those games are now going to be slimmed down and held in Glasgow. So there is an issue with the sort of massification of these games and the inability, or the taxpayers in these cities just don't want to host these games. John?
Yeah, actually, you can go back. I don't think you can underestimate how badly the Delhi 2010 Games kind of did for the Commonwealth movement and people wanting to host it. I was actually I'm going to show off here. I was in St Kitts and Nevis in 2011 for a work trip. Martin and I both worked at the same publication, and people weren't happy that I got sent on this trip. It was a Commonwealth, or Games Federation it was. It's a Commonwealth sport, and they had an election year, and it was between Gold Coast and Hambantota in Sri Lanka to host the 2018 Commonwealth Games. So this General Assembly was held, not even 18 months after Delhi. And, you spoke to the kind of bid consultants and they said, it's really close and, it's a good race. Hambantota's the new kind of offering for the Commonwealth. And you've got Australia, which is a good sports market. Gold Coast absolutely smashed them in the vote. It was like 4 votes for Hambantota. When you spoke to everyone afterwards, they were like, there's no way we can go somewhere that just doesn't have the infrastructure yet. We can't trust it's going to be like another Delhi. We've got service providers that still haven't been paid. Some went out of business. So it had a massively on the next cycle of the games, if you like. If you look at someone like Durban that wanted it in 2022, they pulled out. I think there was a real fear in the Commonwealth Games kind of corridors that they needed cities and countries that had the infrastructure to make this a success. They couldn't have the problems of Delhi. So it's kind of taken a decade and a bit to get to the point where they feel comfortable now. And obviously India's changed over the time and infrastructure's changed. But yeah, I don't think you can underestimate how bad the legacy of those games were. But it'd be interesting, Catherine, because Canada's often been dubbed, always talked about as, they'll kind of be, it's always England, Australia, and, sorry, Martin, UK,
oh my goodness,
Australia.
Where's my lawyer? Hang on a minute.
Well, and you've
Where
got
are
your
the
flag in
Commonwealth
the
Games
background.
next summer, John?
I'm sorry. The UK, Australia, and Canada will always bail out the Commonwealth movement, but it's certainly not been the case in Canada for a few years.
Well, absolutely not. The last time the Games were hosted in Canada was in 1994 in the city of Victoria, which only has 500,000 people. And I know their facilities, the Commonwealth pool there, last time I was there, the tiles were falling off the ceiling and they had to close it. So they would have to not only accommodate a vastly increased games, but they'd have to update all the facilities from 20 years ago. And by the same token, the province of Alberta and the city of Hamilton, Ontario, were both considering a bid, but they withdrew, with the Premier of Alberta, or a senior politician in Alberta, saying that the burden was just too high for the province to bear. And those are quite telling words, aren't they?
Yeah, this is a very loose term that's hard to pin down, but there was an expression of interest from Canada, according to the Commonwealth Sport, to host in 2030, along with India, Abuja, obviously, in Nigeria, and 2 unnamed countries. But yeah, it's hard to know just how far that went.
I guess the point is, and we can certainly leave this for another podcast, but are the Commonwealth Games, are they too big, or are they still relevant?
I think this one's going to be fine. You've got, but 2030 is going to be crucial. If that works, if they can get the way the Commonwealth Sport are talking, they're very much hand in hand with the organisations and authorities in Nigeria to make Abuja a workable project. If that can work and you can get a right size there and a right cost base, that hopefully will encourage other countries throughout kind of Africa and Asia to put their hands up, because otherwise you're just going to have a very small rotating number of countries, and then it doesn't really get very appealing for anyone. So I think India will work perfectly well. It's where it goes from there. Can they kind of regenerate it as whatever this is now, Commonwealth Games 4.0 or whatever we're on?
Yeah, I think you've always kind of got to... We have a slightly different view of the Commonwealth Games sitting in Scotland or England, John, as to how big I've said this previously, but you speak to sort of a French person or a German about the Commonwealth Games and you get a qua or a vas. What are you talking about? The commercial revenues aren't huge. We did this on a previous podcast around Glasgow. You can kind of listen to that if you're kind of keen to understand what they are. The revenues in Delhi were only, according to the auditor report, I think only $38 million at the time. So as a result, you have to, and as this is happening in Glasgow, really make serious cutbacks, and there'll be no athletes village, etc. They'll be staying in hotels and stuff. So let's see how Glasgow fares. Let's see. I think the Commonwealth Games has been right-sized, to use a PR term, and if it can work at a scaled-down model and be successful, or if a country wants to come in and properly put massive funding behind it and absorb that loss, then yeah. But as we know, there's only so many countries, Commonwealth nations that can do that.
And we will see next month whether Ahmedabad is indeed confirmed as the host. Now, it still is, I suppose, provisional, but very likely, and the confirmation or not will come in a few weeks' time. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We're going to be right back after a short break with both of you coming back on to talk about what you are looking at for the week ahead. We'll be right back in just a few seconds.
From stadium naming rights and cricket to multi-club ownership and global sponsorship, unlock the most trusted data and insights in our reports. Explore more at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. We're here for our final section where we look ahead to what's coming next week and any other business that strikes our fancy. Now, among the two of you, who has something that is appealing for the week ahead? Tell us your looks ahead.
I'll go first. It's something that I think the sports media industry has been anticipating for a while. We expect quite soon a resolution to where the media rights, well, we know where they're going, an announcement, should we say, on the next media rights deal in the US for Formula One. There is a couple of F1 Grand Prix coming up in the US to finish off the season, starting this weekend with the Circuit of the Americas. So there may well be an announcement in the coming days around Apple taking F1 rights in the US, which would obviously take them away from ESPN, which paid a huge amount of money to take them, a massive rise in rights fee, mainly off the back of the interest coming from Drive to Survive. F1 understandably wanted almost double the amount that ESPN are paying, which they balked at. Apple have come in and, by all accounts, put the right check down. What that means for F1 TV, F1's in-house channel, what that means for the F1 interest in the US going forward when you're putting it on Apple, where the subscription numbers are way lower than most other streaming platforms. Certainly, I've just spent some time in New York, as you know, speaking to people, and people aren't kind of overly enthused with Apple, with MLS deal, in the fewer eyeballs you're getting. So F1 is certainly taking the check in the short run. What does that mean in the long run? So yeah, keep an eye out for when that eventually gets announced.
Martin, what are you looking at for next week?
I mean, I think it has to be Sportel. We've got a strong delegation of us going to Monte Carlo. I think it might be my 20th Sportel Monaco. It's either my 19th or my 20th. I don't know if I went in 2005. Certainly my 20th trip, at least, to Monaco. The first one was 2001 with my best mate, he was driving his mum's very aging Saab estate, and we were trying to complete the Formula One track, which you can't really do, but that was fun, as you do at that age. We stayed in a kind of very downbeat Formule hotel, motel up in the hills, not the Fairmont or the Hermitage or the Monte Carlo Bay. That's what we're looking ahead to next week. I mean, there'll be certain major topics inevitably. The UEFA tender will be one of the big ones. The club competitions media rights tender launched in Europe's big five markets, plus the global pick aimed at streamers. Obviously relevant football partners will be downstairs in the bunker rooms at the Grimaldi, having very important meetings with broadcasters. A big question that people really asking will be the impact on the broadcasters in those other markets, France, Germany, Italy, Spain and the UK. How will this package affect their bid, whether it's awarded or not? So obviously, there's bidding in both scenarios. So that's a big one. Agency ownership is always a big one. I think Infront is getting closer to a sale. And then also private equity and sovereign wealth fund investment in sport has been a major issue for the last few years, and it will continue to be next week. Imran Yusuf, our executive editor, is hosting a panel on Monday, 11:35, just on that. Investment in sport. Where is the next 1 billion coming from? And he has Danny Townsend, CEO of Surge, will be there. John Martin, CEO of Professional Fighters League, and Jamel Agua, I hope I pronounced his name right. Kevin McCulloch will tell me if I haven't. The CEO of Kings League, who will be there to discuss that. So that and a whole lot more next week, including standing outside an Irish pub, almost getting run over at 3 a.m. in the morning.
3 a.m. for you, but...
Well, that's ambitious.
And just to add to that, I will be hosting an interview with Javier Tebas on the Tuesday afternoon, where we're going to talk, or he is going to talk, not just about piracy, but about media rights in football and about governance. So that's another unmissable feature there. And just to, I hear you saying that you've been there 20 times, and I raise you by adding that I think I might have been at the very first one back in the very late 90s, where it was held in tandem with the AGFIS, with the GAFES annual Congress, and it was in the Fairmont, and I had to introduce Prince Albert to the crowd. So I had to stand up on stage and do the Grosby's kisses to Prince Albert and introduce him to the waiting crowd.
Lots of suits and ties then.
I might have been one of about 5 women.
Yeah.
And I was probably the only one who wasn't serving coffee. So there you go. Times have changed, and it's much more balanced now, and it's good fun, isn't it? So we'll all be there next week. And moving on to any other business, I think John, you had something that was quite quirky to mention, didn't you?
I do, yeah. We're too light-hearted on this pod, so I'm going to offer a bit of a weighty topic, which is the World Grand Sumo Tournament, which has been taking place at London's Albert Hall for the first time in 34 years. It's been here. I think they're trying to kind of broaden its reach a little bit. But yeah, some great numbers around it. It started on Wednesday. I think it finishes Sunday. You can't buy any more tickets, I'm afraid, unless you want to go VIP. That's going to cost you 600 quid for a VIP ticket. But general sale have gone. But it was the guy on the radio from Royal Albert Hall. He was on BBC Radio yesterday, just talking about how successful it's been in terms of, sold out crowds and, great demographic of people there. But he said some of the key facts, they've had to reinforce the toilets out back for the athletes. I'm doing athletes in quote marks for those not watching the video. They've had to bring in chairs that can take 200 kilograms of weight. Normally it's 100 kilos of weight. The chefs have been cooking up 70 kilograms of rice every day. So just some great numbers. But I think, Martin, did you see something? You streamed a little bit on the BBC.
Yeah, it was on iPlayer last night. I was amazed.
Yeah, I think Paramount on their Pluto channel was showing it in multiple markets around the world. So yeah, good luck to them. Hopefully they'll come back and there'll be a young group of sumo fans going to school dressed, well, maybe not on dress down day. You don't really be wearing a sumo outfit, but it's the next big thing.
I hope they had the bandwidth in place, John. I've just stolen your joke. Sorry.
You stole my joke from earlier. They didn't have the bandwidth for sumo streaming.
Well, you two are probably too young, and this dates me, but I remember in the 90s, sumo was a big thing on Channel 4.
Transworld Sport.
Metcalf. It was.
Yeah.
Adrian Metcalf came in and he commissioned programming on sumo wrestling, and it was a huge hit. Millions of people watched it. But that was the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, anyway, tune in for the final at the weekend. It should be fun.
Great. Martin, have you got any other business?
I can't beat that, but I will give you that Cape Verde Islands have qualified for Gianni's expanded World Cup with a population of 525,000, which is the same as Sheffield. So it is a lovely romantic tale. Yes, it's an expanded tournament, but what a story. Although here in Scotland, it just makes us wake up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat, to be honest. These are exactly the kind of teams we struggle to beat. I'm fearing a fever dream whereby we lose. This is if we qualify, of course, which is a big if. But I can see us losing to Brazil heavily in the first game, drawing 0-0 with Uzbekistan in the second game, maybe in 40-degree heat in Monterrey in Mexico, and then having to go into the last game against Cabo Verde, needing to win by 2 clear goals and failing to do so. It just feels very Scotland. I mean, this is a country who's failed to beat or lost to Iran, Costa Rica, Paraguay and Peru as a caveat when these teams were actually not as good as they are now in the distant past in the World Cup. Yeah, I am fearing Cabo Verde with trepidation.
So I think that's as good a place as any to wrap up this week's podcast. Next week, we'll all be out in force in Monaco. We are in the Grimaldi Forum at stand H0120. Please do drop by and give us a visit. We'll be delighted to host you there if you don't already have a meeting with us. And that's it for this week. We look forward to greeting all our listeners next week if they're there, and we will be in touch. Thank you very much, John and Martin, and we will see you next week. To our listeners, if you want to know more about today's stories or any of our other reports and analyses, and especially if you're looking for the world's largest collection of accurate rights fees across media and sponsorship, you know where to go. Take a look at subscription options on our website, or get in touch with us via email at info@sportbusiness.com. And as always, if you enter the code SBPodcast30 at the checkout, and that's SBPodcast30, you'll get a 30% discount on annual and monthly Sport Business subscriptions. Please don't forget to share your thoughts on this episode and give us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms. And watch for our weekly LinkedIn posts promoting the podcasts, where, of course, you can also leave a comment. Thank you all for tuning in, for reading, and for subscribing. I'm Catherine Davies, and we'll be back again next week with the Sport Business Podcast.